Before I begin, can I pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present? My name is Padma Raman. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Rights Commission. My job today is to do as little of the talking as possible, so you all get to hear our wonderful Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Rashida Manjoo. The Commission had the benefit of having Rashida come and visit us a couple of years ago, and Rashida did some consultations in Australia. So it's a delight to have her back with us. I'm just going to read out her bio very briefly, and then Rashida will speak, and we'll open it up to hopefully really good discussion. So Rashida Manjoo holds the position of UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Its Causes and Consequences, a post she was appointed to in 2009 by the UN Human Rights Council. She is also a professor in the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and the convener of the Human Rights Program. Professor Manjoo has over 3 decades of experience in social justice and human rights work, both in South Africa and abroad. Her research interests include human rights broadly, but with a particular focus on women's human rights. Her UN work over the last 5 years has included monitoring and reporting on states' compliance in responding and preventing violence against women, its causes and consequences. Her thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and General Assembly have included a particular focus on state responsibility to act with due diligence in the quest to eliminate violence against women. She's particularly highlighted the interpersonal, institutional and structural violence, and she advocates a holistic approach to gender-based violence that centres on the interdependence and indivisibility of human rights. So without further ado, Rashida.
Thank you so much, and it's good to see some of you who are at the conference as well, so I'm going to bore you with the same speech. It's good to be back in Australia, and thank you very much to the Australian Human Rights Commission for inviting me. I enjoyed my visit the last time I was here, despite difficult issue, but the responsiveness in all the roundtables, as well as the information sharing, was really useful from my perspective, not because I was here officially, but also to be in a context where there was a national human rights institution that was responsive to hearing about, but also thinking through its own responsibilities when it comes to violence against women. And my hope is that that conversation has carried on in Australia with the Human Rights Commission here. So I'm here particularly for this conference that some of you are at, and it's fascinating, some of the issues that go on in the Asia-Pacific region. I've conducted 5 missions in this region, as I mentioned yesterday. I've been to Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Afghanistan in November last year, India, Bangladesh. And so for me, it's been useful at the conference hearing perspectives from those regions as well. It's just a pity when I do this work that what I don't get is responses after I go on a country mission and produce reports, is what has changed. So, you know, as I was writing my speech and looking at the Papua New Guinea, there was a draft law while I was in Papua New Guinea, and I couldn't figure out, has it changed? Because the government hasn't forwarded information, but neither does civil society. Which, you know, I want to raise one issue with all of you here, because you've made an effort to be here. We have just an hour. The issue of accountability and the issue of state responsibility and accountability is really crucial. It's a theme that I've tried to carry out in my reports. But I also have pushed civil society and academics about their accountability. You have an accountability, you have a responsibility to hold the state accountable, to challenge whether it's, you know, the cutbacks in service funding for services, whether it's on a range of issues, the gender neutrality that I'm going to talk about, etc. And I think, you know, that's an aspect that I would like to reinforce everywhere I go, which is, as citizens, we have a responsibility to hold our states accountable, because we are the ones who put these people into governance, and how do we hold them accountable? And I think hearing some of the issues here in Australia on the funding cutbacks, the impact on women's rights organizations, on advocacy work, etc., I think that there is a need to think more concretely about your responsibility as citizens to be challenging the government on a range of issues. So to go back to my written speech, which doesn't get me into too much of trouble, my off-the-cuff remarks do. Since its establishment in 1994, the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur has studied the forms, the prevalence, the causes, and the consequences of violence against women. And of course, in practice, I look at the issue of girls as well. The mandate has analyzed legal and institutional developments in the protection of women against violence, as well as the remaining challenges, and has provided key recommendations to government and to the international community to overcome such challenges. The mandate has taken on into account the intersectionality and the continuum of violence approach to dealing with violence, which blurs the distinction between public and private violence. My mandate looks at violence in 4 spheres: violence against women in the family, in the community, violence perpetrated or condoned by the state, and in the transnational sphere. Violence against women, as we know, is acknowledged as a pervasive and widespread violation of human rights, resulting in women's civil, political, economic, cultural, and developmental rights violations. But an often overlooked impact of violence against women is the role it plays in obstructing the realization of women's citizenship rights. Viewing violence against women through the citizenship framework, as I did in my 2014 report to the General Assembly, emphasizes women's participation and agency. It highlights the importance of women participating as full citizens in their communities. It also exposes the role that violence plays in impeding women's realization of a broad range of human rights that are essential to the exercise of full participatory citizenship. And it also emphasizes the need for states to fulfill their responsibility for preventing and responding to violence against women and girls, both occurring in the public and private spheres. States have an affirmative obligation to respect, to protect, and fulfill human rights, including fulfilling the responsibility to act with due diligence to eliminate violence against women. Elimination of violence against women is critical to women's ability to participate in the civil and political, economic, developmental, social, and cultural spheres of their communities as full and equal citizens. Unfortunately, pervasive levels of violence and a culture of impunity fundamentally jeopardize the realization of women's right to a life free of violence and the right to participate fully in their communities. In this presentation, I'll only discuss the continuing and new challenges that I identified in my reports of 2014 to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly. Some of these challenges include the shift to gender neutrality, the persisting public-private dichotomy in response to violence against women and girls, the failure of states to act with due diligence in eliminating violence against women and girls, the lack of transformative remedies to address the root causes of violence, including at the individual, institutional, and structural levels, the financial crisis, austerity measures, and cuts in social services spending, the shift in understanding of gendered responses and the move towards a focus on men and boys, and the lack of a legally binding instrument to hold both states and non-state actors accountable for human rights violations as a violation in and of itself. So recognizing violence against women as a form of discrimination, but recognizing more importantly that violence against women is a human rights violation in and of itself, deserving of a suitable legal framework. Progress has been achieved in advancing women and girls' human rights and also gender equality at the national, the regional, and the international level. But there are gaps and challenges that have not been adequately addressed. Continuing and new sets of challenges that hamper efforts to promote the human rights of women and girls can be linked largely to the lack of a holistic approach that addresses the individual, the institutional, and the structural factors that are a cause and a consequence of violence. Moreover, through the work of my mandate, my predecessors and I have observed that the culture of impunity persists, and this contributes to the impossibility of achieving the goal of a life free of violence for women and girls. The shift to neutrality. Violence against women is a systemic, widespread, and pervasive human rights violation experienced largely by women because they are women. In challenging the shift to gender neutrality, I argue that the concept is framed in a way that understands violence as a universal threat to which all are potentially vulnerable, and that male victims of violence require and deserve comparable resources, attention as that afforded to female victims. This perspective ignores the reality that violence against men does not occur as a result of pervasive inequality and discrimination, and also that it is neither systemic nor pandemic in the way that violence against women indisputably is. Attempts to combine or synthesize all forms of violence into a gender-neutral framework tends to result in a depoliticized or diluted discourse, which abandons the transformative agenda. A separate and different set of normative and practical measures is required to respond to and prevent violence against women, and equally importantly, to achieve the international law obligation of substantive gender equality as opposed to formal equality. The second challenge that I identify is persisting public-private dichotomy in responses to violence against women. This is a manifestation of inequality and discrimination in responses. The belief that personal relationships are not a matter of public concerns continue to affect responses in the prevention, reporting, and prosecution of cases of violence against women. The relegation of women to the private sphere is reinforced by, among others, the gender pay gap, the double burden of production and reproduction, which often limits the autonomy of women, and in some instances, systems of guardianship or legal instruments that are consciously designed to limit women's access to the public sphere. Even in societies in which women make sustained and significant contributions to the workforce, their roles in public life tend to be curtailed, and issues considered to be of particular concern to women are often assumed to be private. A third challenge that I identify in my reports is the failure of states to act with due diligence to eliminate violence against women. My 2013 report to the Human Rights Council reiterates that state responsibility to act with due diligence requires that there is a framework for discussing the responsibility of states through a due lens of individual due diligence and systemic due diligence. Individual due diligence refers to the obligation that states owe to particular individuals or groups of individuals, including to prevent, protect, punish, and provide effective remedies. Individual due diligence places an obligation on the state to assist victims in rebuilding their lives and moving forward, and also requires the state to punish not just the perpetrators, but also those who fail in their duty to respond to the violation. Systemic due diligence, on the other hand, refers to the obligation that states have to ensure a holistic and sustained model of prevention, protection, punishment, and redress for acts of violence against women and girls. It also requires an effective system of monitoring and evaluation to ensure that state authorities are held accountable for failure to protect and prevent due to their responses or lack thereof. Another challenge that I've raised is the lack of transformative remedies. Transformative remedies require that the problem of violence against women and girls is acknowledged as systemic and not individual, and also that it requires specific measures to address it as a specific human rights violation. In my 2011 report to the Human Rights Council, I articulated a gender-specific and holistic framework, including protection, prevention, and empowerment approaches. Responses in laws, policies, and programs require that the historical, current, and future realities of the lives of women be taken into account through a lens of indivisibility and interdependency of rights. The creation of hierarchies of violence against women, especially through political and funding action, is a source of concern to my mandate. This is particularly evident in the articulation of sexual violence in conflict situations as being different and exceptional, as opposed to it being a continuation of a pattern of discrimination and violence that is exacerbated in times of conflict. This has led to a focusing on the manifestation of violence against women in conflict situations to the detriment and the ignoring of the low-level warfare that women and girls experience in their homes and communities on a daily basis. Addressing the root causes of violence against women requires one to take into account the continuum of violence approach. Another challenge is the financial crisis, austerity measures, and cuts in social spending. This is even more of a reality in recent years, and I've expressed my concern about the weakening of the women's rights sector due to these factors. This has resulted in donor funding cuts for core service provision, including legal, policy, and advocacy work. Also, the cuts in allocation of funds by governments for social services is a challenge in many countries. Furthermore, cuts in funding to non-governmental organizations as a form of reprisal against the work of women human rights defenders is also of concern. As I mentioned, the lack of a legally binding instrument, I've highlighted the existence of a normative gap under international human rights law in respect of violence against women and girls, and I have recommended that the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly conduct an inquiry into this gap. I would encourage the Australian Human Rights Commission to use any kind of leverage to also push the UN system to look at this. The approach of states, and this is reflected in my 2014 report to the Human Rights Council, the approach of states within the United Nations system is one of normativity without legality. This is reflected in the endorsement of principles by states through declarations and resolutions, but without the development and adoption of specific binding legal commitments as regards violence against women and girls. This issue raises crucial questions regarding the accountability of states in the absence of specific legally binding obligations. This then impacts the state's responsibility to act with due diligence and also the responsibility of the state as the ultimate duty bearer to protect women and girls and to prevent acts of violence. The shift in understanding of gendered responses and the move towards a focus on men and boys. In the past few years, there has been a move away from the understanding of gender focus as referring to women, including with regard to violence against them, as articulated and understood in international normative frameworks and by women's groups. Even though the shift to men and boys agenda is fraught with difficulty, it appears to have attracted a great deal of funding, recognition, and political support. Compromising the resources available to women's groups for service provision and advocacy, including through the prioritizing of men's groups, has been detrimental to the women's rights sector, and it has undermined transformative change efforts. From a pragmatic point of view, if men constitute the vast majority of perpetrators of violence, then engaging them in discussions, educating them to resist and reject the nature and consequences of hypermasculinity and misogyny, and to overcome patterns of violence is an obvious step towards the elimination of violence against women. The feminist approach has commonly considered men as allies and targets of education in the quest for gender transformation. However, in recent years, many men's groups have moved away from being targets of engagement and allies to being leaders of initiatives on gender equality, especially through the setting up of specialized men's organizations to engage men and boys. The logic of the shift in focus appears to be self-defeating, because it empowers the group to which perpetrators belong, and a group which overwhelmingly continues to maintain economic, political, and societal structures of power, privilege, and opportunity to offer women protection from violence and discrimination. There are many ideologies about the role of men and boys in the elimination of violence against women and girls. The responses and discourse often reflects that the focus is not on women as autonomous beings, disproportionately affected by inequality, discrimination, and violence, but rather violence against women is conflated with the interests of men and boys. The argument is that since both men and women are subject to gender stereotypes, and since corrupting forms of power are as damaging to men and to women, both men and women would benefit from the dismantling of gender stereotypes. This ignores the reality that gender stereotypes, powerlessness, and violence disproportionately impact women and girls. A strategy associated with the engagement of men and boys is to appeal to the idea that women deserve respect as mothers, as sisters, wives, and so on. Emphasizing personal relationships is said to make it easier to understand the consequences of violence against women, understanding by men. This distorts the idea of women as autonomous individuals deserving of respect and renders regard for the rights of women contingent on their status in the private sphere. The international community explicitly acknowledged violence against women as a human rights issue when it adopted the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action at the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993. Standard-setting developments such as General Recommendation 19 of CEDAW and the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women in 1993 further acknowledge violence as a form of discrimination that impedes or nullifies women's rights to enjoy all other human rights on a basis of equality with men. However, in spite of these developments, concerns raised more than 2 decades ago reaffirm my view that it is time to consider the adoption of a binding international instrument on violence against women and girls with its own monitoring body. Such an instrument would ensure that states are held accountable to standards that are legally binding. It would provide a globally applicable, comprehensive normative framework for the protection of women and girls from all forms of violence. It would have a specific monitoring body to substantively provide in-depth analysis of both general and country-level developments, and it would serve an educative function, both during the interactive dialogues with states, when states report, and also in the concluding observations of the monitoring body. I thank you for your attention and look forward to our discussions.
Sit up. Or are you happy to stand there?
Since you are recording.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Rashida. I've got hundreds of questions, but I might open it up to the floor. And if I don't see any hands go up very soon, I'm going to ask the first one. Yes, down the back. Stop putting you on the spot.
Should we take 3 and then I can, yeah.
Yeah, back there. Ma'am.
Hi, Amanda Alford from the National Association of Community Legal Centres, the peak body for CLCs. Rashida, thank you so much for coming in again for your insightful comments. I suppose I'd like you to elaborate more on your concerns about the challenges that cuts to community organisations and bodies like community legal centres have on addressing the root causes of violence against women and ensuring that people experiencing violence against them are able to access legal advice.
The other week I attended the AGM for the youth AGM, and they were talking about early prevention in early childhood and trying to make a lot more of it. So it was all based on early prevention and early childhood. And do you think that with what you've been saying, that maybe we could sort of get in with that, as well as making it early prevention and making sure that women and girls, as well as boys, are all part and understand that we all have rights? And I'll stop now because yeah.
Thank you very much. The He for She campaign, I am appalled, you know, at these kind of easy slogans, bringing in big name stars as if that's going to fundamentally impact and change centuries of patriarchy, of the normalization of violence, etc. I also think we are beyond awareness raising now in this context of the work that we all do on violence against women. The posters and the T-shirts and the caps, we are beyond that. We need to be thinking more clearly, why is it that the numbers of women linked to violence are dying in their homes, in their communities? So the continuum of violence. I wrote a whole report on gender-related killings, and one of the things that I see in every country I go to, the statistics are going on. So can we continue to have these slogans and these high-profile people speaking as if awareness raising is going to address the structural root causes of what we're talking about? So for me, there are three pillars that I look at when I go into a country or when I'm writing my thematic reports. I look at, is accountability the norm or is impunity the norm? Because if impunity is the norm, it means that violence against women and girls has been normalized. The second pillar that I look at, is the empowerment of women still on the agenda of a government? We have shifted away from that because of neutrality, because of excuses around funding, etc. The third pillar that I look at is, are interventions going to lead to transformative change? And transformative change means challenging at the individual, the institutional, and structural levels. So I have deep concerns, whatever the reasons are for these kind of campaigns and thinking that it will change. Structurally, it will not change the dynamics. And I think we need to be thinking more concretely and deeply about our responses. The cuts in funding, yes, the austerity measures, the financial cutbacks, in almost every country, it's the services to women that are being cut because of state funding, donor funding, and it's a huge source of concern. And I've raised it in country missions with certain countries. One example is with Italy, that it's one thing because of the financial crisis that and austerity measures, you are either minimizing or cutting down completely on funding to civil society organizations that do legal services, therapeutic services, advocacy work. But when the economy improves, it's going to cost you more. If you do a cost-benefit analysis, you're losing people with experience, expertise, civil society organizations shutting down. And just doing a cost-benefit analysis should make a government think that maybe we need to be cutting back somewhere else, maybe defense spending in most countries, instead of cutting back on social services that are having a huge impact. So it's a source of concern globally, and I have articulated this in my reports with governments. Someone mentioned this morning that if you don't get money from governments, one should look at foundations. But the state is the ultimate duty bearer, right? The NGOs are doing the work of the state in the service provision that they do. And so why is it that money should be sought outside and allow the state to abdicate its responsibility to its citizens and to other people in this country or any country in the world? So for me, it's an argument about holding the state accountable to its responsibility as the ultimate duty bearer to respect, protect, and promote the human rights of all, including women and girls. Early prevention, I think, and interventions, in theory, it's wonderful. The challenge is, if people are socialized, whether it's the bureaucrats who make policies and programs and allocate budgets, whether it's civil society organizations, if you're socialized into a certain way of intervention, that gets perpetuated at the school level. If you go in once a week to provide some sort of civic education, but you don't challenge the stereotypes that are in the textbook that children continue to use, if you don't challenge racism in the classroom, if you don't look at intersectionality. And so our challenge is that it's got to be deeper than the intervention, has to be transformative. It's got to be at the level of the home, the community, the schooling, all the institutions that our children interact with. And the earlier we start, hopefully the better. I come from a country that's deeply entrenched in discrimination, in inequalities. I'm from South Africa. Last week, coming on the plane, reading the paper, on Sunday, coming and reading the paper, there was an awful racial and gendered attack at a school. We are 22 years into democracy, supposedly. a young boy at a school who happens to be mixed race was sodomized with a broomstick by 4 young white men who are his classmates. Part of the issue was that he was considered black and that he had a white girlfriend. And, you know, and I think to myself, what goes on at the dinner tables in those homes that allow for these 4 young men to violate someone in this very brutal way, but also videotape it and then put it out in the public domain? Those 4 young boys will go through the criminal justice system, and all sorts of excuses will be made. But the culpability of what goes on in our homes, what are the messages we send about the other, whether it's a woman or a girl or a person of color or an indigenous person? What is it that we do in our own homes that continue to perpetuate stereotypes about others? And then what does the media do? What do our governments do in terms of this? And I think it goes back to each one of us reflecting on our own actions, how we, you know, conduct ourselves in public and private spaces. What messages do we send, instead of hoping that at the school level things will magically change because they're exposed to human rights and civic education, etc. It won't if the fundamentals are not being challenged.
Thank you very much, Rashida, and may I thank you again for making another visit to Australia. It really is very supportive for us to have your thoughts at the international level. Of course, I would have, as an international lawyer, very much want to support your proposal that we move from the normative to the legal, and we look at getting a treaty with a monitoring system, hopefully individual communications and so on. But I'd have to say, from my own position within the Human Rights Commission here in Australia, there's a certain weariness and disappointment that this very complex process of monitoring through the UN that has taken so many decades to develop with so much hope for the future is largely ignored within Australia. And I think it's probably true for many other countries, but obviously I speak for this country. I think I'd be interested in 2 things. One is, what do you think is the political appetite for embarking on this in relation to violence against women? But secondly, do you think maybe we could be a little more innovative in pursuing the question of state responsibility through our own courts, through our domestic processes, even if many of those arguments are likely to fail because of conflicting domestic legislation? Do you think that we might be able to create an environment in which at least the sense that this violence is systemic and we need the state to accept responsibility for dealing with it might be a practical way, at least, of reaching the legality point rather than only the normative?
Just on that as well, it would be good. Some of us heard what your thoughts were in terms of what an instrument would look like and how it would fit with CEDAW. So that would be good to hear about as well for those who didn't hear it yesterday. Thanks.
Are you able to give us an example of initiative or program somewhere that has this transformational change, that in a country that might have a similar reality to Australia or a country in our region? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Catherine Hunter from KPMG Australia. Thank you so much for your talk today. Thank you for being with us. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the role of the private sector. I think for companies to take on board an issue such as this is very challenging, and they need to be brave. And I'm conscious of the comments about moving beyond awareness raising, and if there's anything you can think of that's very tangible that companies can be doing.
Thank you. From the normative, should we do more?
No,
okay.
that's good.
From the normative to the legal. One of the challenges, as I reviewed 20 years of developments within the UN and coming up with this, that it's been 20 years of normativity without legality, I came across a document that 20 years ago, the Economic and Social Council had mandated the Commission on the Status of Women to think of a framework on violence against women, knowing that it was absent in CEDAW. And at that time, the issues were raised about treaty proliferation, cost implications, and will people sign on to this? Now, these three factors have never come into a discussion when we've spoken about a treaty on disability, on treaty on migrant workers, a treaty now on business and human rights. But whenever it comes to an issue of women and girls, there's always either a backlash or a minimizing of how important legally binding obligations are. I don't have a fetish about the international system. I'm very, very pragmatic about what the UN is. It's a government of governments, and I think, we need to acknowledge that. It isn't this fantastic autonomous entity that can change the world. So the reality is it is a government of governments, and self-interest plays a role. It's not in the self-interest of any of the 193 member states to eliminate violence against women, because they don't see that as a valuable enterprise that they should enter into. So the political appetite, to answer the question, won't be there, because the same three arguments that were used 20 years ago are going to be used and have been used. During my interactive dialogue in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly last year, there were member states citing the same three examples, which of course I had highlighted in my report as well. The political appetite to talk about a new treaty on business and human rights is there. The same governments that I talked to about a treaty on violence against women that's comprehensive, that's educative, that's binding, the appetite is not there. So I think it is a challenge. But my job is to highlight. I have an ethical and a professional responsibility to highlight to the United Nations system what I have identified as a challenge. For me, state responsibility, even if it's at the level of reporting, engaging in interactive dialogues at the UN level, having concluding observations produced by the treaty body, they do serve a purpose. First of all, there is a naming and shaming component to it, because you are faced by your peers. Sometimes the naming and shaming means that countries use the concluding observations or the report of mandate holders inappropriately. Iran has done that in relation to my country mission report on the US. It's a political game, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't change the essence of what's in the report. And I have seen states that have shifted. They may not acknowledge it was because of my reports and recommendations, but there has been a shift in certain countries. So I see that as educative. I see that as naming and shaming, but I also see that as very useful for the other 192 members when a state is being examined to hear what's going on, to see their reports, to engage in the dialogue. I see that as really useful. I don't dismiss that the domestic is crucial. We have to do the global to the local all the time. But I also see the value of having state reporting to a treaty body. I see the value of this dialogue, of the engagement. I've engaged the last 5.5 years in interactive dialogues. There are times when I've been on the podium for 6.5 hours. I'm one mandate that gets the largest amount of comments. But there is a value to it. And I think it's not only valuable for the oppositional states that want to pick on certain governments, but it's valuable for the states that don't know where to look for answers. It's valuable for donor communities to be listening in and looking at those reports, because they can then identify. I've done this where I have pushed, after I went to Somalia, that the donor community needed to focus on certain things in Somalia. I'll do the same in June with my report on Afghanistan. So there is value to it. I think the domestication of norms and standards we need to be doing more work. But more importantly, we need to be holding our governments accountable at the national level to ensure that the norms and standards are there. What instrument? In an ideal world, I would love a full-blown treaty on violence against women and girls, a standalone treaty. It's not going to happen. CEDAW is fighting like crazy against even accepting the fact that there's a normative gap. And I don't understand this, because it is so clear one does not have to be a lawyer to understand that there is a normative gap under international human rights law. So I've kind of made peace with the fact that it'll probably be an optional, it should be an optional, this is my recommendation to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. It should be an optional protocol, the second optional protocol to CEDAW. The first one already provides for the communication procedure. The second one would be dedicated to violence against women, but it should have its own monitoring body. Because CEDAW has 16 articles to deal with. We need a separate body. So in some ways, it'll follow, I don't want to use the word model, but it will follow the optional protocol to CAT, to the Torture Convention, which has its own monitoring body. The other thing that I, having looked at, and I'm going to write all this up in my next report, which I'm supposed to be working on in the evenings. While I'm here, it's not happening. Is that it should have that provision that the optional protocol to CAT has, which is about the setting up of a national level preventative mechanism. I think that is so crucial because it fills that gap between the global and the local. National preventative mechanisms can be very, very useful if they're fully autonomous, they have the power to do certain things, and they see their role as independent institutions, like human rights commissions in many countries, not all, see themselves as independent autonomous bodies that provide a perspective to the international community, but most importantly, it is the preventative mechanism at the national level. This worked very well. I saw this in Honduras. I was on mission. I visited a juvenile detention facility for girls. I noticed that many of the girls had fresh injuries. I interviewed them and picked up that they had been assaulted by the guards. Immediately, I didn't have to go back home, write a letter to the Honduras government or put it in my report. Immediately, I was able to call on the National Preventative Mechanism while I was in the facility to point out, record, and then put it in writing the same evening and send the letter to the government. In the absence of a National Preventative Mechanism, I would have to wait till I got back home and then to the issue. Transformative change examples, I think that's really difficult. It's so contextually, every country is different and one needs to take into account. I saw something in Algeria that I was fascinated by. And, whatever the motivation or underpinnings of why the state was doing this, and I think being an Islamic country, the motivation was more of, and in Islam, you have an obligation, a charity obligation, etc. But women who were homeless, women who were in abusive relationships, women who were widows, women who were kicked out of their homes for so-called moral crimes, were provided with state accommodation in facilities of just a very general nature, shelters as we would call them. But there was a program in place for therapeutic assistance, legal assistance, but importantly, if the women and girls wanted to continue their education, the state would pay for that completely so they could finish their education or enter into a skills development program, which the state paid for. The names were put on a roster, so when a job came up in the state sector, that list was referred to first. So they had the opportunity to become economically empowered, move out if they wanted to, but there was also the possibility of second stage housing, that the state would assist them to go into independent autonomous housing. And it was fascinating in Algeria to find that I haven't seen in many other countries in the world. But as I said, the motivations seem to be based on it's our Islamic duty to do this. And that's fine if there is a transformative potential. In Afghanistan, women who are accused of moral crimes and haven't been convicted, who run away from home to avoid prosecution or being killed, go into shelters. And sometimes they're in those shelters for 5 years because there's no going back. There's nowhere to go back to. You can't go home. You can't go to your community. And I had a meeting with the donors while I was in Afghanistan before I left. And one of the views was, well, shelters are a short term. Why are women here for 5 years? And I'm like, that's not a question you ask in the context of Afghanistan. You need to be asking yourself, okay, if we want to regard shelters through this Western mode of it's a crisis intervention, it's short move, then you have to be asking yourself as a donor, what's my responsibility to ensure safe housing? So, think of gated communities that women could live in. They could help each other, with caretaking and other stuff. But you can't ask the question, why are they here for 5 years? That's not the case. So I think in terms of transformative remedies, it's tough. The private sector role, I'm very ambivalent about it because the few initiatives I've seen is about the private sector, whether it's the big law firms doing pro bono work or other private sector, it's about the media attention for them often. It's in their interest to say, well, we're doing something, we're putting something back, but it's not sustained, it's not transformative. It is about the posters and the going out and taking photographs in a township or with poor people that you know, indigenous people. And I think that's a challenge. That's the external work that they do as part of pro bono or reaching out, the corporate social investment, etc. Yes, building a hospital, a school should be considered transformative because it's a facility that's there that wasn't there, and I don't dismiss those initiatives. But I think in the violence against women sector, there's this kind of thing of wanting the visibility without actually saying what else can we challenge. And sometimes it comes at the cost of not looking internally at your own policies and practices and how women are treated. And, you know, you could start off with, you don't have to wait for an abused woman in your company to come to you. It can start off with looking at the gender pay gap, right? That creates dependency for women that then exacerbates situation of violence. And I think that's, you know, it's a larger discussion. I know the UN has been trying to push the private sector, inviting them to be champions of change, etc. But is it about funding for them as opposed to actually getting corporates to understand sustained, coherent responses to human rights violations? What about the role of corporates in third countries in terms of the forced removal of people off lands, the degradation of the environment, the violence by expat workers? How do corporates and multinational, and I saw a lot of this in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, how do corporates take responsibility? Can we talk about that and not the sanitized versions of those things? Because I think it starts at, you know, at that level. So I feel ambivalent about this kind of, let's pull in the private sector. Is it pulling in the private sector because we want their money? Or is it pulling in the private sector because they have a role and a responsibility? But then how does the state hold the private sector accountable? How does the non-state sector hold the private sector accountable as well? And I think it's a larger question. It's not a simple question of where do we come in. You have a role to play that's really important, but you also have a responsibility in how you do it. And if it's about the corporate image, then I think there's a challenge. Thank you.
Last. I know someone, there's just another couple of questions. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Just two more.
Hi, thank you very much. I just have a question on, given that you've mentioned Somalia and Afghanistan and you haven't really touched on cultural differences and the difficulty of engaging with these states in a way that's culturally sensitive but also respects their sovereignty. I had another question about the role of boys and men. I was recently in India and working with urban refugees and discussing gender-based violence. And a lot of the men became very aggressive about the international focus on women. And they, as a consequence, they stonewalled pretty much any conversations about violence against women. And I'm just wondering about what effect you think it might have if we do de-emphasize perhaps a little bit more the role of men and boys and their position as victims of gender-based violence as well.
Just one last one. Rashida, last year we had the extensive public interest in the Oscar Pistorius trial and the sentence that was handed down. And at least in some media, there was widespread criticism of the perceived inadequacy of the sentence. What significance do you think sentencing plays in combating violent crimes against women?
Thank you. Cultural difference in respecting sovereignty does not mean that we tolerate acts that are justified on the basis of culture, religion, or tradition. And I think that has to be challenged all the time in terms of women's human rights. So I respect sovereignty in the way I do my work because I'm there at the invitation of a government when I'm carrying out a country mission. But that does not mean that I will accept explanations that are based on culture, religion, tradition that are used to justify violence against women. So I think sensitive, but the underlying issue is, yes, there's state sovereignty, but it's not at the expense of the human beings, and the international community has an obligation to point that out to countries. The men and boys and being defensive, I think the backlash against women's human rights, against women human rights defenders is very, very clear. We live in a world where there's a backlash. The F word is a dirty word. We cannot talk about feminism, so there's a depoliticization, a diluting of what we mean when we talk. I'm very clear, I talk about violence against women, and I'm very glad that that's the resolution in, on my mandate. And it isn't this kind of blurry gender-based violence nonsense that's coming out that is, it's neither fish nor fowl, to put it, and it really is problematic. So I think that challenging patriarchy, challenging misogyny, why does it have to become a men and boys issue when we have years and years and years of experience of feminists and women's rights activists doing this work? Just because men feel threatened and fearful. I think there's a way of challenging all the isms without people feeling that they're disrespected or that something's being taken away from them. And I think when I hear the question, when men say, what about men? And I say, what about men? And I had this conversation here in Australia with Aboriginal men, because they told me very clearly they did not want to be in a meeting with me because my mandate was violence against women. What about the men? I say, what about the men? When you are prepared to give up power, privilege, and the patriarchy, let's talk about the men. And I think that's something, it's about our strategies. And, so yesterday at the conference, someone said, I could not work in a certain country and say that I work on women's human rights. I need to work with the men and boys. And the funder, is giving me the funding based on this. I said, I see that as a strategy you use to get an entry point into the country, to be able to talk about what's considered a very difficult issue. But it's the strategy. The principle is that you want to challenge power, privilege, and patriarchy, right? But your strategy and entry point is, well, if I have to start the work on saying my program is on men and boys because that's the only way you're going to get the funding, you have to accept that it's a strategy. In the long run, your goal is about challenging all the structural aspects. The Pistorius case, I think his due process rights were appropriately defended. I think the prosecution screwed up big time. On that issue. They didn't have a strong enough case. They didn't bother to do the work, and they were flying on the issue of his famous status. Does sentencing help? I think I wouldn't say it's about sentencing. I would say it's about holding perpetrators accountable in the same way that we need to be holding state authorities accountable for failures to protect, to respond appropriately. So it's about holding people accountable and then thinking through what are the creative options for sentencing? What is most appropriate? In South Africa, there was a time about 10 years ago when I began thinking, if we incarcerate perpetrators, it actually is a death sentence for women, because men go into prisons, they get sodomized, they pick up HIV/AIDS, they get infected, and they come home and pass the infection on in many instances. And so I had to rethink also, but accountability is a non-negotiable. But how we think about sentencing patterns, about what is the goal on sentencing, I think that's a different discussion. But we should be able to say this is a crime, this is a human rights violation, and that's not negotiable. Thank you.
Thank you all. That's probably your last time, Rashida, as the mandate holder in Australia. I know that you said that national human rights institutions should use your reports, and we do, but we promise to do more with them to keep our governments accountable, and I hope our NGO colleagues and friends will do the same. So can we thank you again for your fantastic contribution today.